Yeah, thank you. So my title has nothing to do with any of the C-level executives. I am our head of global programming at the moment, which deals with a new division that we're launching that is about direct-to-consumer publishing, where we're actually packaging material, packaging pictures, videos, and making them available to the public, showing you a few ads along the way, of course, but in general, making it easier to discover a lot of the great content on Getty Images. Prior to that, I have done a number of different things at Getty Images. I've run 2 picture desks for a number of years, groups of editors who deal with incoming photos from our photographers. I've once been a photographer myself, not for Getty Images, but before I joined the company. And I've also helped build a mobile app called Moment, which is iOS only and still available on the App Store, which was a few years ago our first step into engaging our broad group of contributors, both on the editorial and the creative stock photo side, to make it easier for them to submit images to us. And I've been trying to send pictures by smartphones ever since 2008, roughly. This one is from 2011, but even then, networks weren't always quite where I would have wanted them to be. Before I move on, I wanted to see a quick show of hands, because some of the conversations over coffee got me curious. Who here in this audience actually has no smartphone? There are a few hands. I'm not counting, but there are a few hands. Not yet, that's perfectly fine. Who in the audience here uses actively things like Instagram, either Instagram itself or something similar? Okay, that's about a third, maybe half, okay. And last question, what about Snapchat? Anybody active on Snapchat? And it doesn't mean that you have an account, it means that you actually actively use it. 2, okay. Thank you. So my talk is, in some ways, going to be a lot more basic than some of the high-powered research that we've heard before from the universities. I'm going to do a very brief history of smartphones and how it relates to what I'm talking about. I'm going to talk about immediacy and authenticity, again, as it is relevant for this talk. And I'm going to talk about a few of the key challenges that photographers voice, professional photographers, and suggest some of the opportunities that I think arise out of this. And I'll take a brief look into the future as far as I can tell. So, smartphones. Some of you, most of you, will remember these guys. I hear that some people actually still use the thing on the right-hand side. I was a proud owner of this one, of that one, and of the very last Nokia one. They were great at the time. I think they might even have had cameras in them. I'm not even sure about that. Because in reality, for anything that we're talking about, this is the year 0. This is where it started. When Apple introduced the iPhone in early 2007 and became available a little later that year, that is the moment when really, as other speakers have mentioned, you know, the technology and the availability of the connectivity really started to merge. So the few of you who don't have smartphones yet, you're in good company. There are at the moment around 2.5 billion smartphone users in the world, and there's about 7.3 billion people in the world, so a third of the world has smartphones. The 2/3 don't yet. I'm sure over the next few years that's going to change a little bit more. And again, as others have mentioned, it'll be a function of availability of networks and connectivity, and frankly price, of course, in some areas. So before the smartphone, and with the smartphone photography really being a very unique visual expression that has only been a thing of the past 10 years, we have had nothing else before that. There were tries. Our friends from Sony Ericsson actually have a little, I don't know if you can read it, down here it says quick share. So they tried to introduce features like that, making it better and easier to share the pictures that you took with your camera phone. But anything that you could do there was transmitting a picture by MMS. I don't know if anyone really remembers multimedia messages. I remember the name, but I don't remember actively using it because it was cumbersome, it was slow, the resolution was not very good, it was expensive, exactly. And it was only one-to-one. It was an interpersonal communication, but not in any way, shape, or form the sharing that we know today. And then there were, of course, pocket cameras. And we all know that some photographers, like our friend Terry Richardson here, have used pocket cameras with great success in their professional life. But it's just not the norm. And so the key to all of this really was not just the devices, but also the interlinking of the platforms that are then used to share and distribute these pictures. And that's frankly why I find it so important to explore new platforms when they come out, and new devices when they come out. You have to gain an early understanding of how they might change societal norms and mass behavior. And a lot of the things that some of the previous speakers have talked about is something where I was always just sitting in my chair and nodding along because I felt all this, I knew all this. I never had the research to back it up, but from own experience and from own usage and from observing everyone around me, I could absolutely tell you 100% true. And so that is the key to getting an early jump start on what else is out there. You got to play around with these things and see what it feels like and if that might work. So we've heard a couple of numbers. I too prepared a slide with numbers. So there's a timeline of what I consider some of the key points in time on this relatively short journey so far. Again, year zero being 2007. Our friends from Flickr, they launched in 2004. And they're a little bit outside of this whole thing. They did also add a good mobile app. I don't remember exactly when. I think it was sometime after Instagram. It was 11 or 12 when they came out with a good usable mobile app. Until then, they weren't quite on that mobile sharing train. Instagram in 2010 was the key inflection point because prior to that, there was no other simple sharing mechanism, mass sharing mechanism for pictures where you could easily follow along, where you could just see pictures as big as the phone screen was wide. 2011, our friends from IM launched, Germany's answer to Instagram, but they never got quite as much traction as Instagram, so I'm keeping to the main international ones here. Snapchat in 2012. That's actually pretty amazing because I think many of us slightly older folks haven't really heard of Snapchat quite as close in proximity as Instagram. I think it took a few years longer to really settle in and realize that somebody was using this and there was this new thing and it was interesting. These numbers are probably only a fraction of what's really going on out there. The 400 million images, 1.3 billion and 3.2 billion in 1 year after another are images that are shared per day. And this is, English billion, so this is Milliarden in German, of course. So these are shared on Facebook properties, which is Facebook itself, Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp, and Instagram. And Snapchat too, by numbers that those companies themselves reported. What's clearly missing here is WeChat, the Chinese WhatsApp, if you will, and any other large-scale social networks that would otherwise facilitate this kind of exchange. And of course, iMessage. iMessage is not on here because Apple doesn't release these numbers. So that's quite an explosive growth that you see there. And if you think about it, that's, at least in 2015, if you think about the 2.5 billion smartphone users, that's 1.3 pictures per day per user. So each one who's carrying around one of these things is sharing more than one picture on average. And the reason why these numbers are so huge is essentially this. Younger generations have replaced text communication with visual communications. We usually talk about millennials, but the generation coming afterwards is Generation Z. And you know, when we muse about how can you deal with 2 screens at once, they do run their lives on 5 screens at once. And they communicate with images. And that is also where, of course, the rise of emoji folds into the whole thing. So to sum it up, smartphone cameras enable visual conversations. That's really what they do. They're there, they're in that device that you communicate with. And if you want to show something, or if you want to you know, help someone, then you just send a picture, or you send a video. Because if I ask my friend Ralph how to properly fry a schnitzel, then rather than explaining the whole thing to me, he sends me this. And it actually helped. So thanks, Ralph. But this wouldn't have happened pre-smartphone age. It just couldn't have. You know, the devices weren't there. He wouldn't have picked out his big camera. He is a professional photographer, so he does have cameras. He could do this, but who would do, you know, go to such lengths? I would have had to look it up on YouTube, which was available, of course. And this is essentially the exact same thing, or the exact same behavior that your kids are doing on Snapchat, just with different topics. So part of the headline of my talk is about immediacy. And I know that many of you guys know what immediacy is, and this might, you know, I can probably skip over this for some, but I just want to go through real quickly what I want to describe immediacy as. And it's about more than being close. It's about feeling connected to someone or something. It's about being transported to a location where you can't be physically. It's as if you're there. And that's immediacy. So I can take you along to the site of the original Woodstock Music Festival, and you're not there, but you know, you can enjoy the sunshine there with me. You can sit with me and some famous, well, industry famous friends in the sun outside the annual Eddie Adams workshop in upstate New York. Or you can feel like you're suffering with me through a torrential downpour in Rio de Janeiro. Or you can enjoy the view with me as I sneak behind a waterfall at my hotel pool. And you couldn't be there because there really is only space for one person. So that's me. Best of all, our friend Bradley Cooper lets us hang out with him and his really famous friends at the Oscars. And that is immediacy. When you see this picture come up in your stream, you can absolutely feel as if you're there, even though you're not. So we can bring you along. That's about a visceral experience of things. And then there's authenticity. And just to be sure, to avoid any doubts, I'm not focusing on technological or forensic authenticity of images. I'm not, you know, dealing with, is this a perfect, true copy of another image or something like that. I'm really more thinking about the social construct and the expectations. You know, the philosophy behind, is this an unstaged moment? Did it happen exactly like this? And is it not materially altered, perhaps beyond some cool filters? Because the expectation these days is there that filters to alter the visual effects of an image tend to be applied. And those are often more benign scenes. You know, you can work with me through the creation of this talk. You know, they also allow you to experience that moment, but they're often less visually exciting, cluttered perhaps, or full of photographic imperfections. That was also mentioned before, all those reflections in the window, not a good photo. They're just unstaged moments. And frankly, they're often not particularly flattering either, which is okay if you're me. But in many cases, the indefinite public availability of images is either unwanted or downright damaging to people's reputations. And that is a problem which was addressed when Snapchat and very recently Instagram stories came out. We also heard about this before, the notion behind Snapchat that the default is delete and images and frankly any kind of communication on the platform is ephemeral and just evaporates again, is built in, baked in, and that is the appeal of that platform to many, especially younger users. But that doesn't mean that we as humans don't crave that feeling of authenticity and even beyond those protected spaces. And obviously advertisers know this too. And in order to sell you stuff, they need to bring you with them. They need you to experience their products and services in a certain amount of immediacy. It needs to feel authentic. And you should have fun while doing it too. So here's an example. This is not a very recent example. This has been a few years ago. Ben & Jerry's. I think the thing was called, yes, there it is, Capture Euphoria. And there were no prizes promised. There was nothing really inherently given out. It was just a call out to their audience, to their users, to their buyers. And with this, they found real brand ambassadors, people who were very much into Ben & Jerry's. And they then went out and surprised them with a bucket of ice cream or some other things. And so there was a conversation going on with this, but it wasn't promised up front. So this was a real authentic brand to user, brand to customer experience. Here's another example how the Gap uses user-generated and brand imagery, licensed brand imagery together. This is called What's Blue to You, and it was a pretty impactful, cohesive result of them mixing in professional photography and user-generated material. This is a Tumblr feed with Gap content and customer content, and it's certainly not all about jeans. Sure, ultimately they would like you to think of their jeans when you think of something blue. Perhaps for some people that achieved that. But it is a good example of where companies are connecting with users on that immediacy and authenticity level. Here's another one, also very blue. This is from Pepsi, just user-generated stuff. These are found in spontaneous moments. So a lot of this stuff is just, imperfect. It just shows either the logo or something relating to the logo, people enjoying the product. It's just found moments that they then curated and published on their platform. And here's the last example that I want to show. And this is Lufthansa. The campaign is called Nonstop You. And it is travel from a passenger's point of view. Now, the professional photographers among you, at least those, probably most people will recognize that this stuff is professionally shot imagery. This is probably not smartphone originated. And that's not really the key here. The point is that the visual language is influenced by what has come out of smartphones. So this, sometimes somewhat imperfect, these found moments, something that looks authentic, looks like, you could have been there. All of that, sure, is crafted and staged in this case, but they wouldn't have run this campaign with this style of images had our consumption behavior and our expectation of images not changed over the years. Which brings us to challenges and opportunities. One challenge that I hear a lot from photographers and friends or other colleagues is quality. Quality as a selling point, rather. And quality is an important topic. and an important reason why people choose professional photographers. Have a look at this relatively small and this relatively large billboard. They're both part of the Shot on iPhone campaign. Coincidentally, both pictures I also took on an iPhone. But the quality, not just of capture, but also of the apps to change, adjust, and optimize images, has improved tremendously over the last few years. And it just isn't a constraining factor anymore today. So if you relied as a photographer on explaining to your clients that only you could produce these great images for these big posters because only you had these big cameras, that's probably an argument that you have to replace with something else. Because ultimately, the quality of these devices has gotten to a point where when the right factors come together, it's perfectly fine and absolutely good enough to be used for large-scale reproduction. The second challenge that I hear is somewhat similar to the quality argument is the equipment argument. Only I have the big long lenses, or only I have the high quality camera bodies and the lighting equipment, and only I have the wide open lenses, for example, for portraits. And here's an early example of where that's going to go. This is my friend Marco, and Marco was nice enough to pose for me a few days ago. And this is the original image, and this is what my iPhone made out of it. This is the new portrait mode, just released about 2 weeks ago. And while it doesn't hold up so perfectly, and if you look very closely, there are imperfections, but frankly, this thing is probably one of the best low-light pocket cameras I've ever owned, and it's really nice and flat. And so the argument that you need to hire one of us with professional equipment, well, probably still holds a little bit today, but not so long anymore. In fact, the reality for many of these things is, depending on what you want to do with these images, good enough is often good enough. And so the key is finding the right balance between cost and hassle and result. And what I just showed you, of course, can't hold up to a wide open Leica lens. That's an entirely different story. But they're fine for lots of the ephemeral, transient content that we've been talking about here. And you need to buy a new phone anyway every year once it comes out because something else is getting better and you just recently dropped it and need to replace it. And so you might as well go with one with a great lens, and then you have it all in one package. And that's it, good enough. For some photographers who rely on purely on stock photo sales, and that is, of course, some portion of our contributorship, with high volume that people now start to license comes a certain amount of price pressure. So where one customer wants licensed an image for, let's say, $500, they certainly won't license 10 images at the same price point. You might be able to convince them to pay $100 per image, or 60, or I don't know how much. Fortunately, I'm actually not in our pricing segment, so don't quote me on these prices. The whole pie increases a little bit, but an individual photo's slice obviously gets smaller with that. And depending on how the makeup of the package of images is done and who contributed to these, that might mean that for an individual photographer, it feels like lower prices and price pressure. And that's something that needs to be worked out, and that can be problematic. And then there's this notion of competition and easy market entry. I started my photographic journey in a time when Canon had just recently released their wide lenses and good autofocus system, and suddenly people like me were able to shoot sports. And the guys who had spent long years perfecting the manual focusing of of their lenses and figuring out when to actually release the shutter to get, you know, the header and the two people going up and the ball hitting the head of one guy. I was able to just follow the thing and click. And that, of course, didn't feel really fair to them. It felt fine to me because I didn't know it any other way. And that was just the norm for me when I started. And in a way, we have a similar time right now. You know, this authentic style is an opportunity for, let's call them untrained photographers, to break into the market. And if they have other selling points, you know, be it their personality, their availability, perhaps their willingness to work for a certain amount of money, then that is an opportunity for them to, you know, get a foot in the door and see how this goes. But really, it's, as I said, it's just the latest in a long string of such competition. So, you know, it's just the way of the world. There will always be a new technology that enables other people to skip some of the learnings and some of the experience that we all had to go through. And it's something that, you know, you can't discuss away, but I also wouldn't want to dwell on it. And actually, I think that it is something that can be embraced as an opportunity, and I'll get to that in a moment. And lastly, something that I wanted to add and just acknowledge, I added this slide very recently after some of the other previous talks. There are certain societal or cultural expectations. So for example, we heard a lot of talk about the expectation of privacy, and is it okay to always have a phone and a camera recording device on, or the expectation of focus, the expectation of are you present in the moment, or are you distracted by your phone while you're sitting at dinner with me? All of that is something that certainly varies from culture to culture. And this challenge is not one that is unique to professional photographers, of course. That is just for the wide usership of smartphone photography. So for photographers, it comes down to their eye and what other services they offer. But it also comes down to how they might embrace these opportunities. So, you know, you could just choose to shoot like it is shot with a smartphone. And some of our best-selling photographers do that all the time at this time. This is material that is clearly not shot with a smartphone, and is very similar to the material that you saw in the Lufthansa advertising campaign. But it fits that visual bill. It fits into that aesthetic that has been made public and widely available with smartphone photography. Then, frankly, you can just shoot with a smartphone. We've seen a number of examples. Bruno's showed us a few this morning. Ben Lowy is a well-known American photojournalist who is represented by Getty Images and has done that at a number of occasions. And the key to that is that he and a lot of others are not just shooting with a smartphone and perhaps publicizing some of their work on these social media channels, but they actually are sought out for that. They find new audiences and they find new clients with social media. It's not really an advertising channel for them. It is more of a way of, you know, being available and being present, just like you used to spend a lot of time on your home pages or your websites to display your portfolios. Your running portfolio these days are things like Instagram. And I just picked out 3 examples, some of whom you might be familiar with for one reason or another. On the left is a photographer called Max Münch. He's a German photographer who I don't know personally, but his stuff is, you know, he's traveling around the world. It's wonderful travel photography if you look at the account and follow him. And he finds ways, you know, sometimes to shoot for the local tourism boards or organizations like that enable him to do this. Similarly, the example in the center, Forrest Woodward, I do know him personally, and he's an adventure photographer. He has a pretty good influx of requests that all point to the work that he's showing and showcasing on social media. He doesn't always take these assignments. Not all of them fit his personal style of photography or what he wants to do. But a certain number of people find him that way. And so this is his way of generating professional income. And on the right-hand side, I had to resort to Instagram. Jerome Jarre is really more known as an influencer on Snapchat. Alas, on Snapchat, you can find a profile and you can take a screenshot of it, so I used this. And what he does is he gets hired by companies, by brands, to run their Snapchat channels, their Instagram, their social media operations for a day or for 3 days. He takes over their handles. He does something unique, something that is, that fits with the brand, that he discusses with them beforehand, that fits with his personal brand. And a huge number of his followers tend to follow him around. And they just come to see what Jerome is up to today, and they enjoy that. And if he's, talking about some new campaign that a company is running, that is certainly something that then influences his audience, and that is a perfect form of smartphone photography. That is a very direct usage of the medium, and I hear he makes good money with that. The fourth opportunity really is, something that I want to tell all of you, especially those who don't have active accounts yet on these things. It's your personal projects. This is your ability to collaborate with others, to play around. These devices include so many functionalities, and they're so easy to use. There are time lapses, there are slow motions, there's panorama. I'm pretty sure that pretty soon we'll see some kind of 360-degree capabilities in the not too distant future. And it's non-committal. You don't really have to spend a lot of extra money, you don't have to spend a lot of extra time. It's playful. You can just jump in and play around with it and see how it feels. And that's really what it comes down to. It's a very emotional, visceral thing. And so playing around with these things, testing out new things, finding an audience for that, and it might just be your 150 friends who also follow you elsewhere. That's okay. Or it might also be, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people who appreciate your view of nature photography. And none of that has to be, you don't have to overthink it. If you look at my examples, some of them are nice because I actually spent a few minutes on them, and some of them are not particularly exciting images. They're just something that, I was intrigued by, that I wanted to play around with and try out. At some point I might have realized that I hadn't posted anything in 3 days, which is not ideal on these platforms, so I tried to find something. But that's the thing, it floats by. And if you don't like it, well then don't like it and just move on. It's a very simple way of interacting with the world. So, what's next? I think one thing that we all should have a look at again is this. So Google Glass was a first prototype, and it got a lot of media attention, especially in Germany and Central Europe. But it was too expensive. It tried to do too much at the same time. It looked pretty ugly. And it needed to rely on Google's services too much. So it required connectivity, and it required your willingness to, share what you saw with Google servers, and many might have not liked that. Spectacles by Snap, the company that is making Snapchat, is what you'll be seeing your kids wearing pretty soon. So at a price point of, what, about $130 or so, this is Christmas gift territory for most Western societies. And once their use is established by millions of millennials and Generation Zers, you can surely expect more of the first-person perspective to be in demand by advertisers. Because once people get used to it, well, they want to use it to sell you stuff. So I would say probably around this time next year, if they deliver in time for this year, Christmas. Then there's VR and AR, virtual reality and augmented reality. I would say augmented reality much sooner than true VR. True VR still requires a lot of processing power. And it's exciting when you try it out, when you get to play around with these systems, and you truly do get a sense of what is in store. But AR is probably the next big thing. I remember a very early app for the iPhone, it might have been in 2008 or so even, was an overlay of the nearest subway stations in New York. I could just lift the phone and I could see my street ahead of me, and it would say the E train is up this way and the F train is that way, and if you go around the block there's some other train. And it would tell me how far that is. And if I turned around, well, the arrows would follow me and realize that I'm looking a different way and adjust accordingly. And if I tried it out in Berlin and opened it up here, it would tell me that my nearest train was, I don't know, 6,000 miles away. I don't know, I think that app has ceased to exist, but it was great. It was a nice early idea of what is possible. It didn't really catch on that much at that time. But yeah, AR I think is something you want to look for. Another interesting idea that goes into the VR and AR perspective is, so we heard earlier about the huge amounts of pictures that are produced every day by smartphones. Everybody who's taking a photo, even if they don't post it anywhere or publish it anywhere. If you imagine you have a lot of cameras, for example, in a soccer stadium, and they're all pointed inwards, and you get your hands on this data and you get the ability to stitch them together and you have the processing power to do that, then you end up with something that is a lot more interesting than a 360-degree picture today. Remember, the 360-degree picture today is a camera in the middle of a room and then you can look around. And it is already pretty exciting. If you see these things, for example, on Facebook or on other viewers, the New York Times has just launched a daily 360. And you play around with them, it's amazing. You get this whole different sense of place wherever you are. But very often, if I were to take a 360 here, I would have a lot of roof here. I would have background, which is not that exciting, despite the nice logo. And then I would have all of you guys in the picture. And if there was a way to have more cameras around the room or around the stadium, all pointed inwards, that will allow you to actually create a model of what was happening there at that time, which would then allow you to really inspect it. I could walk around, I could look behind the column, I could sit down next to somebody. Or I could, look at the action on the playing field and see how my favorite player was actually, kicking that ball that went into the net. So there's a lot of interesting possibilities in the future. There are rights conversations involved that need to be resolved. There are processing power and technology conversations which need to be resolved. But I think that's something that we'll probably see in the not too distant future. At least somebody will experiment with it, and then we'll see how it works out. Lastly, drones, of course. DJI, one of the drone companies that has a few of the best-selling models out there in the market, just released a new one. Pocket, foldable, is capable of following you around even without a tracker on you, so it has a little bit of visual recognition built in, and it can just fly with you as you're taking your morning jog or something. It's pretty amazing. I think the image quality isn't quite as good as with some of the other drones because they needed to go for a slightly smaller camera, but it's a pretty amazing toy to play with. And once you combine all this stuff in an exciting way, you can create really exciting visual conversations. And of course, video. I think Cisco just released a statistic recently saying that by 2019, they estimate that 80% of consumer internet traffic is going to be video. And yes, a lot of that will be Netflix and reruns of old series that you weren't able to catch up on because we have hundreds of channels these days. But ever more will also be either brands requiring video or little Snapchat style short video things, videos that help me fry a schnitzel, whatever it might be. So video is a big thing, and again, I can only speak from my experience. As a photographer, I never had a video camera. I could never afford, nor did I want to lug around a big video rig. But I'm able to play around with either my DSLR or my smartphone. And my smartphone is frankly much easier to play around with than the DSLR in this instance. So for me to get a sense of what is possible with video, what works, what doesn't work, smartphone is great for that. So that's it. We've come full circle. We've looked at challenges, we've looked at realities, I think a few opportunities. There are really two things that I want to leave all of you guys with. First off, be agile in your thinking. Just like you adjust course along the way of, say a software project or adapt to changing environments in life in general, do the same when it comes to networked camera technologies. See what works, see what doesn't work, play around with it, and then decide if it's for you or not. Nobody forces you to participate in all of this, but dismissing it without having tried it, my mom always forced me to try at least the food that was on the table, and I didn't always like everything, but it was not a bad idea to live life by. And most importantly, enjoy yourself with it. Be playful and embrace these opportunities these devices offer you. It's fun, and when you have fun, you're authentic, and authenticity sells. This was fun. Thank you.
Any questions, or everything is clear now?
If it was just too basic and too clear, that's fine.
There's a question.
That's one.
I have just one practical question. When you, most of the photos we have seen is in his example, others also from your artists you represent or your photographers you represent. How do you handle the topic of personal release? Because most of these pictures receive their charm by capturing an authentic and sudden moment. And nobody runs around and has a contract in his pocket to ask the person afterwards to release it.
Actually not true. No? A lot of our photographers and a lot of our contributors do exactly that. Legally, there is no way of getting around a release. I mean, there is a way of getting around a release, which is you label the picture as editorial use only, and you don't sell it for advertising or commercial use. But then, of course, it becomes a lot less valuable because you can't sell it for commercial use. So a number of our photographers, the ones that do make a living with commercial stock photography, they do either carry apps with them on their phones or they carry written papers, and they do ask for releases, absolutely. And they often get turned down. That is such as life. At that point, they can enjoy the picture by themselves or on their social media stream, but not sell it. It's not an ideal solution, but I think it is a fair solution because, as you say, the other subjects, they do have the right to refuse. They do have the right not to be used in advertising, and they certainly have the right to be asked. So, at the moment, this is the best approach that there is.